Welcome. Thank you for your time on this. Well, where I am, it's another sunny Sunday evening. Workshop 2, building a parent-focused communication culture. Tonight, we're going to look at methods. There are some really nice ways of thinking about the parent context and also some just looking at real-world examples, the way that schools engage with parents to try and help and improve the way that you approach all of your communications with parents. The subtitle of today takes us straight to another one of those pain points in a school that we know from personal experience does irritate. Why don't parents do as we ask them to do or as we need them to do? You know, we think we make it clear to the parents what we need them to do, where they need to turn up, etc. But it's like herding cats sometimes. We think that it starts with two crucial foundations. One is understanding the parent context, as I've just mentioned, and the other one, which we'll talk a lot about this evening, is developing exemplary listening skills. But just briefly, before we go on, for anyone who wasn't here last week, we'll introduce ourselves. Simon, do you want to go first?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Simon. I don't know whether you can see me, but I apologise for my hair. It's gone locked down, completely out of control, and I desperately need a haircut. So I'm a teacher. I've been teaching for over 15 years. I teach at Wellington College in Berkshire. I'm taught at a range of different schools and working with Pete, to try and solve some of the communication issues that schools have, which I think is really important, especially in the current climate. And hopefully we can make a difference to the way schools communicate in not just now, but in future, even once hopefully this pandemic is over. Pete.
Yeah, one day. I'm Pete. Now I've never been a teacher, but I've worked with schools and in schools for most of my career. I've worked in corporate communications for 20 years, which is a very grandiose sounding thing. It covers a whole range of things from advertising to public relations to website development, all sorts of stuff. But a lot of it has been focused on education and on schools in particular. For about 3 or 4 years, I was the head of communications at TES, and that gave me a really good sort of top-down perspective on education in the UK, but also internationally. For a period of my life, of my career, I was working inside a schools group, and I was on the SLT for a little bit of that as well. So I have seen that from the perspective of the school, and I'm a parent. We're both parents, so we're on the receiving end of a lot of school communications too. I just quickly remind everyone of our mission at Just Add Parents. We were a relatively new organisation. We're a startup really. We're here to try and train and campaign to improve this particular issue of school and parent communications. Our mission is giving schools the confidence and skills to create a positive parent community. And we focus a lot on confidence because communication is as much of an art as it is a science. And a lot of the time you're doing things that you might plan really well and think through very thoroughly, and it all just goes a bit haywire as soon as you engage, because you're dealing with humans at the end of the day. And in those circumstances, you really need confidence to know that what you're doing is generally the right thing, and that you've got the right responses when things go a bit wrong. It's not just about skills. Confidence plays a huge role here. And the other part that we focus on a lot is the community aspect of it, that we think that there's a big difference between having an audience of parents and having a community of parents where your school is a member or a participating part of that community. The reasons that matters is actually, if we think about the benefits of what we're trying to deliver through these workshops to the school, one of the lessons from the corporate communications world is that it costs a lot less in terms of time and resource to host a well-managed community than it does to manage an audience or sets of people. The reason for that is that communities have a tendency to, if they're well organized and well structured, they tend to self-manage to a certain extent and self-heal when things go wrong. If you're trying to constantly deal with parents as though they're customers, and it's a sort of customer service role that you're playing when you're dealing with parents, it's relentless. And as we'll go through this evening, sometimes the balance is it's so imbalanced that it's almost impossible to please those parents if you treat them like customers. And I'm not saying schools do, but you'll see what my point when we get to that section. Community, on the other hand, if you're part of a community, the community doesn't need managed. It manages itself, and you can shape it by your participation. So we think actually this approach is about saving schools time and money as much as anything else, certainly making life easier. From the parent's perspective, a well-managed community, if you're a parent being part of that, feels good. Actually, parents are already a community, whether or not schools treat them like one. But it's much nicer to have the school inside that community from a parent's perspective. It gives them a lot of that confidence that we've talked about, that they know what to do for their children. It's good for teachers because we understand from the teachers we know and we speak to that there's a disconnect between what a teacher is trying to say to a parent and then what comes in sort of left field from the school. So by having a more open approach to the way that schools and parents engage, it can really, with teachers being in that community as well, it can really overcome some of those impediments. And from the student's perspective, well, we should always come back to the point that this is in the end all about learning outcomes and the learning journey that children are on.
What we're going to be covering this evening, introduction we've already done, and then we're going to set the scene with some context about parents and communication, and then look at, well, we've divided communication for the purpose of this workshop into two sections. First being inbound communication, which is the listening, and the second is outbound, which, if you like, is the telling. Last workshop we had a look at communication and Communication Act, and for it to be effective, the school needs to be good at both parts of this, both the inbound and the outbound. So practical one, we'll give you some methods. We're going to look at one method, which is the survey, and some real world examples and what you can do right and what you can do wrong. We were going to do the outbound today, but actually we don't have time. So we're going to do that next time. So just so you're aware, a lot of the scene setting that goes on at the beginning of this workshop is relevant to the next workshop.
In terms of scene setting, we're going to go back to one of the foundation stones of good communication, which is understanding the audience context and our relationship with them. So we'll spend a few minutes this evening exploring what it is like to be a parent today. We've gone through a lot of data and actually gained some really interesting perspectives from that. Then we'll take a moment to look at what it looks like for a school or any institution for that matter to be a good listener, what it looks like from the parent's perspective in this case. And we think it's helpful for schools to understand that and think about that. And then finally, we'll touch briefly on some thoughts about language and tone. And then later in the workshop, we'll get into more real world examples.
So we're gonna do our first little exercise. So again, this you can do on the chat function, which only Pete and I can see. And just answer the sort of the two questions on the screen. So the first one is, what phrase would you describe the time pressure that parents are under? And the second one, which is a quantitative one, how many of the external emails sent in the education sector do you estimate are ever read? So we'll give you a minute or 30 seconds. I'll read out a couple of things that come through on the chat. Interesting. We've got quite a good range on how many of the emails are read. 60%, 50%. 25%, 5%. So range from 60% to 5%. So that's quite interesting. 30%. So actually, of the research done, emails, government and public body emails are top with 30% ever read, and then religious ones from religious bodies coming at 25%. Education ones a third on the list with 23%. So relatively, that's quite high for a sector for the amount of external emails that are actually read. But obviously, that's only 23%. It's not actually that many. But if you compare it to retail, which is 10 to 15%, it's it's better. But that does present a problem, which is if you think about the external communication that the education sector is putting out for parents and other bodies, it's not a lot is getting through. So one of the things we're going to have a look at today is how we solve that. Now, in the scene setting, we're going to address three areas. The first one is the digital environment. So this is just very general, just what is the digital environment that we're all currently living in. The second one is looking at UK data, how parents spend their time. And from the answers we just had, quite a few people seem to think that parents are time pressured. And the third one is how this translates into time pressure that the parents are under. And actually, we have a quite surprising discovery that maybe it's not quite as bad as we think it is. This is sort of data on a global scale. So we're going to have a look at some trends of digital usage. First, you can see the global population on your screen at the moment, and that is rising and is expected to do so. That's a given. The second on the screen, which will come up in a second, is the online population and the social media penetration. Okay, and these from 2012 are growing faster than the global population. We are becoming more digitally active. Okay, or more people are becoming more digitally active. Now, this is a sign of development, which is good, but there is a network effect. So for every one new person that's added to a network, they bring on average another 150 new connections. So it's exponential. So we're all exposed to this exponential growth on the online network that we're a part of. The third thing, which is going to come up now, is email. So email is the most prevalent form of school to parent communication. And email was sort of, back in 2011, was declared sort of dead. There were headlines that email was on the decline. And this was, a lot of this was to do with spam. But the email providers have managed to get control of spam. And as a result, email has continued its upward ascent. So, and if you look at the growth, it's even outstripped social media. So today, you can see there are more than 300 billion emails sent and received every day. So on average, that's about 200 each. And some of these obviously will get to each of us. Thankfully, the volume of spam has dropped. So of those 200 emails, more of them are legitimate than they otherwise would be. But if you add this picture all together, you can see how the past decade has been transformative in digital communication. And there's a lot more communication to handle. And this creates inbound pressure for parents and equally outbound pressure for schools. So the next thing we're going to look at is this rise in communication and what it does to parental time. So we're going to look at two connected metrics: watching TV and being online. And again, we started in 2000. So over the past 20 years, the amount of time we spend watching TV in the UK has barely changed. It went up gradually until sort of 2010, 2011, and then it's been dropping slightly for the past 8 years. Started to drop more quickly in the past 2 years, so we may be seeing a major structural shift away from what was classically defined as television, but you know, Netflix box sets on our phones, etc. Perhaps it's all changed a little bit. Now, look at the huge growth in the time we spend online every day. Now, bear in mind that this includes work time as well, but nevertheless, it's very clear there is an upward trajectory there. So now, if you add both of these things together, to get the amount of time we each spend engaged with a screen, it's quite scary. It was up from 4 hours back in 2000 up to nearly 10 hours a day today. And bear in mind, these are averages. So there are obviously some people who aren't on for 10 hours a day and some people who are on for more. So what this really means is that parents are in some ways busier than ever, but importantly, in another way, they're more accessible than they've ever been because of the screen time. So research shows that people tend to fit non-work related tasks into the working day in a way that they didn't used to, and particularly when they're possible by telephone, email, or online. So the fact that parents are more locked into their screens and their mobiles means that you've never been able to reach them as easily as or schools haven't been able to reach them as easily as we can today.
So reaching parents then has become, in some ways, in some respects, easier. So it raised for us the big question: what does it mean in terms of getting their attention? So we know that parents are online, which actually means that they are in some ways proximate, but are they looking? Are they ready for us when we're trying to reach them? So we were looking at some data to sort of back up, test some hypotheses around this, and actually we found something which was quite fascinating, as Simon mentioned a moment ago. So just recently, only in the past 2 months, Nat Sen, who are one of the UK's most respected social research organisations, they are the people who conduct the British Social Attitude Survey, for example, which has been running for almost 40 years. They do an enormous amount of research into social and consumer behaviour and that sort of thing. But just 2 months ago, they published a new report which looked at 2 sets of data that they had gathered over the past 20 years, and they realized it contained within it information that they could use to look at a specific hypothesis. Their hypothesis was that UK-based parents are under more time pressure than they've ever been under before. They found actually that their hypothesis was wrong. And they looked at specifically 3 metrics here. The first was multitasking. So this was based on diaries kept by parents in 2001 and 2015. And what they found was that the amount of time spent multitasking back in 2001 outside of work was about 35% of the day. Now, as anyone knows, multitasking is a sort of a necessity in life in the modern world, but also the research shows that it is a suboptimal way of behaving. It's less efficient than focusing on something specific, and also it brings a degree of stress and anxiety with it. So there are real negatives to multitasking. So parents found that they were multitasking about 35% of the time back in 2001, and that had dropped quite significantly to 28% of the time by 2015. The second metric that they looked at was just the answer to a question: are you feeling rushed? And the answers included all the time, and then some less strong answers. But the percentage of parents who said that they felt rushed all the time was up near 40% in 2001, and it was 30% in 2015, a really significant drop in parents who were saying they were feeling rushed all the time. And the third one here was what they term fragmentation. What it actually means is how much time do you spend on any given task? So the shorter the time, the greater the fragmentation. And here they found the trend was positive in these terms the other way, though. So the amount of time spent on any given task had risen from about 35 minutes to about 40 minutes. Now, when you put these 3 things together, as they did, what they realized was that it's a picture which, completely against their expectations, and I think against ours, it's a picture that says that parents in the UK, while they are more beset by external information and messages and people trying to reach them than they ever have been before, which these days is not just coming from the government or school or brands and companies, but also from their friends and colleagues and people they met years ago and whatnot. They are beset, but at the same time, they appear to have become better at coping with that. What that really tells us then is that while parents might be busy, and while they might be receiving a lot of information, they are capable of distinguishing between what they do want to spend their time focusing on and what they don't want to spend their time focusing on. And what that means from a school's perspective, I could probably summarize it in a sentence which says, get their attention and then don't let go of their attention. Because what it says is if you're able to make sure that parents categorize you into that part of their daily life where they do want to pay attention, you're in. And if you're in, you're going to get more of their attention than you would have had a generation ago. So parents are actually much more proximate and reachable than perhaps they would have been in history, in historical terms. And that goes against what we would have expected. And I think in those terms, that's grounds for optimism. So it definitely means that for schools, the challenge is positioning yourself as the right sort of organisation to be categorised by the parent as worthy of their attention. Now that then takes us on to the next thing we wanted to look at here, which was, what does it mean for an organisation, which could be a school or it could be a company or any other sort of organisation, to be a good listener? And we've got a couple of thoughts here which might be quite insightful for anyone who is responsible for a school turning up in that way to parents. So it starts off with this ratio, 5-to-1. Now you might think in a healthy relationship, balance means even or equal. But in a relationship between an organisation and an individual, it unfortunately doesn't quite work that way. So in customer service, in the world of corporate communications, in customer service, it is often said that bad experiences outweigh, or the impact of bad experiences outweigh good ones by a factor of about 5-to-1. And that sort of means that you need to do 5 times as many good things to counteract every bad thing that you do. And a bad thing doesn't mean being criminal or being dangerous or aggressive. It might just be letting someone down in a small way, but those things add up. So where does this come from? Well, the most recent research that this is based on was conducted in 2004, where researchers found that they looked at companies, they looked at teams within companies, and they categorized teams as either high performing, which is measured in financial terms and other things like that, medium in their performance, or low performing teams. And they found something fascinating. They found that in the way that they communicated with one another, that in high performing teams, team members tended to communicate with one another using praising type of language 5 times as much as they used critical language, 5.6 times in fact. In medium performance teams, they would offer positive words about twice as often as negative words. And in low performing teams, they were using critical language about 3 times as much as supportive language. Those were nagging at one another. So it was quite clear from their research that you found that there was this ratio of 5 to 1 was really important in terms of the way teams communicated and behaved with one another. Go back further, back to the 1970s. This is a photograph of John Mordecai Gottman, an amazing name, who is a psychologist based in New York. And he and his partner in the 1970s were doing couples counseling, and they discovered a pattern. They found that they could predict with 90% accuracy whether a couple would last. And they discovered it wasn't based on how much they argued with one another, for example. That was one of their working hypotheses to begin with. But it was actually on to do with the ratio of how many negative experiences they had, like arguments or fights, compared to how many positive experiences. And those might just be small moments of listening or paying respect or moments of affection. And they found the ratio, again, was 5 to 1, that if you have an argument, you need to do 5 good things, as it were, to make up for it, so that the relationship feels like it's more good than bad. 1 nice gesture doesn't make up for an argument. It takes 5 nice gestures. So there is actually, there are grounds for seeing where the behavioral sort of psychology underpins this. But what it says is that you need to think of it as an organization that if you let the parents down, if you're a school and let the parents down, you're going to need to work quite hard to make up for that, which might explain why sometimes parents never appear satisfied, or sometimes when you've maybe solved a parent's problem, it doesn't seem to appease them if they've had an issue. The relationship between schools and parents isn't balanced in the way that you might wish it was, but there is a balance to be struck. It's not 1 to 1, it's 5 to 1. And if you go in with your eyes open about that, it might make life a little bit easier when your responsibility is parent communication. Now, the third thing we wanted to look at in relation to parents here was language and the way the role that plays in building connections. So here we're going to look at evidence that comes from a very highly cited paper by Gary Hornby from 2011. Hornby and his research partner Raffaelli were looking at what barriers there were to parental involvement in education, and they were looking specifically at language and communication barriers as part of that. So their analysis drew on 25 years of research. And what they found was that schools typically approach communication with parents logically. That shouldn't be a surprise, I suspect, but schools typically look at it as a job that needs done and there are goals to be achieved. The goals probably are things like accountability. We need to be seen to be accountable to our school, to our parents, to other stakeholders, in general public terms. There are problems to be fixed. There are things that have gone wrong, let's put them right. That sort of logical thinking. And we know there are some families here who are vulnerable, at risk, for example, and identifying those and creating special interventions for those, and making sure that it's the running of a school, it's the running of an organization, it's a very logical concern. Now, parents are completely different. The way they approach communication with schools and involvement and engagement with the schools is much more emotional, much more emotionally charged. So for them, it's about their child, it's about my child. Who are their friends? How are they doing? How do they compare? And it's also about what's my role? How can I help? So when a parent asks, how can I help? It's driven from a good place. This is about looking after their children, probably. And actually, it's one of those questions which not all schools find it very easy to answer. It's not always clear what parents can do to help. There might be some well understood sort of natural things that parents can do, but if a parent who comes to you fresh one day and says, I'd like to do something for you, some schools are great at taking them that abroad, but not all schools are ready for that. So there's a big disconnect here. One is logical, one is emotional. And our observation of a lot of the school communication that we've looked at is that it seems to fail on 2 specific counts here. One is that school communication can come across as quite bureaucratic. And I don't want to be overly critical, because a lot of it is very good and certainly contains a lot of good content, but almost a little bit tin-eared. You can see we've looked at now hundreds of school email newsletters, or newsletters rather, as part of another piece of research we were doing. And it is quite clear that they are written on the terms that matter to the school. You know, this thing is coming up soon, that's why we're talking about it now. But it's also quite bureaucratic, and that can come across through the language used, jargon used, and that sort of thing. The other thing, though, is that ironically, when it's not being bureaucratic, it's quite emotionally charged as well. A lot of school leadership teams or school heads are quite emotional, and the way they express themselves can be quite emotional. And often that's a good thing, but it's not always a good thing. And it feels as though there's a potential lack of volume control there, sort of, you know, context, knowing when the right time is to use that. Things that we would sort of say can be a solution to this. One might be personalization, and we will talk about this in a lot more detail when we get onto the outbound communication workshop. But the idea that each parent is at a different point in a sort of journey between being very happy and being very dissatisfied for some reason. And actually the classic head teacher email to all parents completely fails to differentiate between parents where they are in that context. So just by that alone, just by saying that these parents right now are angry at us, maybe send them something a bit different. Just something as simple as that might go a long way to improving the situation. It might also just be finding ways in the technology to use their names, use the children's names in the communication you're sending out. And that can all be done in an automated way. So there's a lot of personalization that can be done that doesn't take any time or effort from the school. Second thing is style. So as I said, we've seen a load of different communications, and there is a real range of styles there, and it's very idiosyncratic. But not all of it is very comfortably informal. And by what we really mean by that is that sometimes you see very informal communications from head teachers or from schools, and clearly sometimes that's good and it works. And sometimes you see very bureaucratic and very sort of official looking communications. What we would say here is your community is unique, and the only way to really engage what's going to work for them is to try it out. So we would urge probably trying out a more informal style, not necessarily throwing emojis into the subject line of your emails from day one, but that is not uncommon, and you never know. There may be certain times that might be appropriate. The third thing we just touched on here is about jargon, and we've said this before. Jargon has a really important place in education, and teachers and school leaders use it all the time. It's a very complex profession, education, so you know it naturally has its place. Often it's said, don't use jargon. We think it's slightly more subtle than that. If parents don't understand your jargon, don't use jargon. But the alternative approach there might be to bring parents into your community, as it were, and help them understand what the jargon means. And by teaching parents about the language of education, you might find that some of them respond very positively to that. And actually it's the first step on a pathway that allows them to get more involved in your community. So we wouldn't just say, don't use jargon. It might be a bit subtler than that. But yeah, ultimately it's all about closing that gap between the head and the heart at the end of the day here, and making sure that you understand the parent's context typically isn't information-based. It's much more emotional than that.
So now we're going to have a quick roundup of what we learned so far. So first of all, parents are more available than they've ever been before. And they've got more time, and schools have almost an instant access to parents through various digital platforms. However, parents are better now at filtering out through the noise. And so it's easy for communications to get lost. Or if you like, the real challenge now is cutting through that noise of everything else to reach parents. The second thing is getting the balance right. It's 5 to 1. So 5 good experiences compared to 1 negative experience. And lastly, language and tone really do matter in what you're doing. So we thought we would pause and reflect. So that's quite a lot to take on board. And so before we move into the next the practical section, we thought we'd just see if you're all still awake, and have a go at thinking about, from what we've been through, what one thing do you think you could implement today to improve your ability to connect with parents? More honest and concise comms. Yes, we're going to look at that in a minute, actually, in a bit of depth. Consider more ways to personalise communication. Yes, and it's so easy to do this. So there's sort of software platforms that just make it really easy. About different points. Satisfied. Yes, the satisfied dissatisfied scale is interesting, isn't it? And actually tailoring it to where they are on that. Good, good. So there's some food for thought there. Brilliant. Should we let's move on now to the practical, the inbound. So now we're going to we're going to turn to our attention to inbound communications, or what you might call listening. So we want to think about three different kinds of listening. The first one is informal. Now, this is just having a chat at the school gates or the classroom door, or any other sort of informal interaction with parents. And usually this information, the information that's going to come out of this is ad hoc and it's never codified. And actually, it's really important stuff. It's like the flesh on the skeleton. That there's enough stuff there for a whole workshop in itself. We definitely don't have time to go through that one today, but that's a really interesting part of what we are looking forward to going through with you. The second one is formal listening methods. And these are typical market research type things, such as focus groups, surveys, parent meetings, conferences, etc., where you have agreed objectives and parameters, and the information is purposefully codified. The most common method of formal listening is probably the survey. And that's what we're going to have a look at in some depth today. And the reason for concentrating on the survey is that it's probably the easiest thing for schools listening to take something away and make a significant change to what they're doing as a result of this workshop. So we'll go through what makes a good survey, what makes a bad survey, and tips on how to get it right. And you can't, because you can't deploy surveys too frequently and expect a good response, especially if your design is faulty. The last one is passive listening, and this includes the use of observation. So who turns up, who brings good energy, it includes use of data, who opens what, who clicks what, who passes what on. And we'll look in that more detail again in a future workshop. Again, there's a whole workshop there in itself. We'll move on to getting surveys. So getting surveys right. So we're just going to spend a little bit of time looking at the subjects of surveys, because they are very common. They're the most common listening, codified formal listening method that schools use. So I think we've got a PDF of this that Pete's going to send around, so you don't need to sort of get too worried about exactly what's going on. So to succeed, a survey must achieve its goal, which is the first thing. And we're going to have a look at this in a bit of depth, but this is the starting point. And if you get this wrong, you're going to fail. The survey won't work. The second thing to succeed, it needs to secure valid responses to the questions. And validity is important. And actually that comes from having a clear goal, okay, which again will become obvious in a moment. The third is to provide a picture that's comprehensive and accurate, or rich and insightful, or both. Okay, there's a slight difference between those two things: comprehensive and accurate, or rich and insightful. And lastly, it needs to portray an organization that's seeking information for sound reasons and then acting on that information. And this is really about perceptions. So a survey communicates to its audience by the questions it asks and the layout it uses. Now, a good survey can demonstrate an institution that's organized, efficient, in control, knows where it's going. So whilst we, especially schools, tend to think of a survey as a flow of information it's also an outflow of information, and you need to be aware of that. So let's look at failure, and it's sort of slightly the other side of the coin. Securing a low completion rate, and therefore you just don't get a large enough sample to make the data useful. Gathering incomplete or invalid information. This obviously negates the whole point of the survey. Now the rest of these points are about the information outflow to parents. So if you do a survey that doesn't drive any organizational response, this leads to quite a poor perception with parents in terms of wondering why on earth you did the survey in the first place. It's like an incompetency problem. Revealing ignorance or some other negative trait. If you're asking questions about things that you really should know anyway, that's a problem. Sending unplanned or unwanted messages. There's lots of hidden information that by the questions you ask, you release doing a survey, and obviously that can lead to negative word of mouth with parents on WhatsApp, etc., etc. Okay, so those are the goods and the good and bad. So how do you get this right? Now, as I sort of mentioned a second ago, it starts with having a clear goal. Now, if you think that the goal of the survey is about collecting opinions or collecting information, you're wrong. That is not a goal of survey. You don't have a proper goal. So your goal needs to be focused. Now you can see on your screen that you know it's probably going to start with an infinitive. I'll give you just two as an example. So let's say to explore, which is bottom right. So let's say the goal of the survey is to explore parental attitudes towards teaching of LGBT or sex education in school, whatever it might be. That's a goal. Let's take another one to measure, top left. So a goal of the survey might be to measure how satisfied parents are with the school's extracurricular offering or after school clubs. So once you've set your goal, it's possible to make some additional judgments that are crucial to how you design your survey. If your goal requires a complete response from all parents, you've got to focus on keeping the survey short and simple. Okay, prioritize completion. For example, if you're asking parents whether their child is available for a school trip, you're going to need close to 100% to be able to plan the trip properly. So don't put this question in the middle of a bigger survey out of context, etc., etc. If your goal is to build a rich and nuanced picture about school life, you need more probing questions with more opportunities for wide-ranging and open responses. So, for example, it might be a survey on student well-being, and where you're trying to get a picture of parental perceptions of how their children are coping with both with the home life and school life, and that balance. And even if you only get 5 to 10% response rate, it can still be filled with insight and nuance, and it can inspire decisions or a basis for discussion on initiatives, policies, etc. So there's a trade-off here between completion and richness. So, and you need to be very clear at the beginning about what it is you're trying to achieve. Do you need completeness or do you need richness? Once you've agreed your goal, it helps to expand that into a set of supporting and hopefully measurable objectives. And at this stage, you should get a clear sense of direction, and it's time to test the approach. And Pete's going to go through this now.
Cool. Thank you, Simon. So one of the pieces of feedback we had last time is that going through real world examples is really helpful. And yeah, we definitely think it's a better way of learning about our subjects to sort of see it in practice. So some of the other factors about good survey design and deployment we'll look at now through the context of this real world survey. So what you're looking at there on that very sort of tall, thin green line is the survey. It's 18 screens long. It's actually quite short, I think it's fair to say. This is from a nursery setting, but I think the lessons that we can learn from this are absolutely valid at any phase and actually in any context at all. Good things about this survey, and in all of these instances, there is a lot of good to be said. In this case, it's a survey, and a survey, the fact that an institution or an organisation is conducting a survey is in itself quite a good thing, usually. This one was done in such a way that it was very easy to respond to. It was using a technology platform, typed form, which works really well on even pretty old devices. So it's very inclusive in that sense. We think that's good. It was sent to parents about a month after the coronavirus shut down. So parents had been at home with their kids for that period, and this would have been one of the first things that they'd heard from that nursery. And it stated that its goal was to collect information about parent and carer views to help us plan future services. So quite a vague objective or goal, but we also felt as though, because it was quite short and it didn't take really that long to complete, it seemed that completion was being prioritized there. That said, we did find some issues with this, and we think 7 areas that were useful lessons for everyone in this workshop, but also 3 of the areas that we thought are really quite critical and could jeopardize the success of the survey completely. So let's just look at some of those critical issues first. So this is the opening screen of that survey. It makes a commitment that we want to draw your attention to here. It says right up front, we will provide an opportunity for families to resubmit this survey every fortnight. Now, That's a laudable sentiment, and given that this is sent in the context of COVID-19, and also it would have been one of the first communications to be received by parents, you can understand why there's a desire to make a sort of confirmatory commitment of some sort to instill confidence and whatnot. But from our perspective, we would just say that sort of commitment is making a rod for your own back. Partly because it's a survey, and you definitely don't really want to be issuing surveys every 2 weeks. They're time consuming for the institution, they're time consuming for the parents. So it feels as though that was a slight error. Now, it turns out this was actually never followed up. So in an almost predictable way, that was an overpromise, and that lack of managing expectations is the critical issue here. If you're going to, if you want to keep a dynamic, updated set of information about the context of parents, which we can infer was actually the goal here, which wasn't stated in the email, there are better ways of doing it. And what we would say in the first instance is put that onus on the parents. Just tell them that you want to keep up to date with their circumstances and preferences, and that they are welcome to keep in touch with you about those changes as they happen. Now, if you know there's a set of parents who don't engage very proactively, fine, have a different intervention for those parents, but you don't need to use an all-parent communication to make that point. So in a way, the issue here was one of mismanaging expectations, making a rod for your own back. It's a classic communications mistake in any sort of terms, but one that was made here. The second issue here, now this is question 2, bear in mind, so this is quite a bad place for this issue to arise. The issue here will jeopardize completion rates. This is a question about opinions. It's framed as asking for an opinion, but it's opinions about safety in a coronavirus pandemic. When is it safe, or is it safe in your opinion for children to return to our setting? Now, the problem here is actually a very classic problem for survey design. It offers yes and no choices, and it doesn't offer a don't know choice. I mean, we can all look at that question and realize it's a very technical question. It's a public health issue. It's complex. Even though it's framed as being an opinion, there are a lot of parents who won't have an opinion on that, or won't be comfortable sharing it. So not having a don't know option means those parents have nowhere to go, and they're only at question 2. And what happens when someone has nowhere to go in a survey is they probably just give up on it. And going back to the last workshop, it's a bit like a sort of cognitive dissonance moment. You're being asked to do something, but you're also being confounded by the same thing. And you probably just give up, walk away. So this really jeopardizes completion. That is a classic error. You must always have a don't know option in any multi-choice survey question for that particular reason. But there's also a second lesson here that we think might be potentially more profound. And this is one of the big lessons about survey design. So we think whenever you're designing a survey, for every single question, you can challenge it by asking yourself these 3 questions. The first question is the person who's going to answer this question informed to be able to answer it? Now, in this particular example, the answer is probably no. Very few parents would feel sufficiently informed to say, yes, it's safe to send my kid back to your nursery. But are they informed? The problem here is if they're not informed, you're giving them work to do. And that's definitely going to jeopardize completion. As soon as you give people an extra piece of work, or an extra, make them spend more time on something, the drop-off rates will be exponential. So the question is, are they informed? And if they're not informed, you really have to think carefully about whether or not to ask that question. The second question is, are they competent to answer this question? Now, again, in this instance, the answer is almost certainly no. Most parents are not competent to answer that question. And if they're not competent, what you get is a dangerous mix of, on the one hand, overconfident speculation by some parents who just do feel confident about that sort of thing. And on the other hand, that probably more common situation, which is where parents aren't confident about speculating about something like that, so they just drop out. So again, jeopardizing completion. And the third thing, which isn't quite so relevant here, but is often very, very important, is can we act on the answers we might get to this question? If you ask, and one of the questions we come up with later in a moment, you'll see there, if you ask a question and most parents are going to answer with one particular answer, and you can't offer that, or even if a lot of parents are going to answer that, and you can't offer that, whatever follows from that answer, it's a dangerous thing to do. You can cause a lot of dissent among the parents, and not intentionally. If you are going to have to ask a question where you can't necessarily live up to what it might entail, you really should make sure you frame that very, very clearly, caveat that in the narrative around it. And even then, you'll almost certainly lead to disappointed parents. Now on to the third critical issue with this survey. So this was question 4. Now, the way the survey was set up was very, it seemed quite narrow, the scope of the survey. And yet here is a question that just says, are you able to work from home? Now, for many parents, the natural response to that is not yes or no, but is, why are you asking? Why do you want to know that? The lesson here is that as soon as you've given the respondent to any survey pause to think about the motives that lie behind it, you've essentially lost them. You've either lost them because they might drop out, or you've lost them because they might start thinking too hard about the answers and second guessing them. And that gets to that point that Simon talked about validity. If you realise that all of the respondents to a survey are effectively gaming the survey to gain some advantage, then your answers aren't valid anymore, and that's jeopardised the survey's success. So here, the question arises about the motivation for asking that question. Why does the nursery need to know whether or not a parent can work from home? We would say that this raises 3 other questions which should be posed by anyone designing a survey before it ever sees the light of day. The first question is, what should the scope be of this survey? What areas will it cover, and what will it not cover? And if, as you're then designing the survey, you test all of the questions against that scope, if you find there are questions that fall naturally outside of the scope that you've introduced the survey with, either go back and rewrite the scope to prepare the respondents for that, or change the question or drop the question. Also, this is a really good point about where you can raise the issue of sensitive questions. If there are questions that are sensitive or personal in their nature, it's a good idea to let parents know that in advance so that they don't get stalled by those questions arising later in the survey. The second question is the purpose. Why are we doing this? Now that, at the end of the day, could be an expression of the goal, and actually a really open and transparent survey could just express that in the preamble, as this survey did, although we think the goal was slightly wrong, or it was excessively, the scope was actually slightly wrong. But if you're just clear about that up front, it should keep you right when it comes to these questions. If it was clear from the people who were designing this survey that this was about getting children back to nursery, it might have occurred to them that asking a question about parents' ability to work from home was not really focused on that goal. And the third thing here is about consequences. It's not clear in this survey what happens with the information that's provided by parents. And as soon as you've given those parents the cause to think about the motivation behind the question, immediately they're starting to think, well, what happens if I answer one way or the other? And it's a natural thing for a parent to think about when they're responding to a school survey, but you've got to understand that it can undermine the validity of the responses. So these 3 questions, if you ask those about your survey overall, it should prevent you from asking these sorts of questions which take the parent out of that space you want them to be in when they're providing with honest answers. Now we'll just briefly look at a few other less critical issues, but learn just with valuable lessons. The first was this was the very first question: what's your children's full name? The two points about this. The first one is that as soon as you ask for personal details, people realise that the consequences of answering a question are much more likely to be directly on them. So if you're asking questions about if you want to gain the net opinions of all the parents about a certain issue or a certain topic, actually the ideal thing would be to ask those questions before you ask them for their personal details, and that's very commonly done in survey design. I mean, don't go too far, you're not trying to trick the people. You might state it up front. The first section here is about general opinions, the second section is about your children. If you do it like that, what you get is honest opinions, and then answers that parents will think probably give their children the best chance of getting the outcomes that they want. But in this case, they asked it right up front, and it might colour the answers to the full set of questions. The second thing about that is just, if you're going to ask just for your record keeping, for ease of interrogating the data, if you've got 3 children, you probably want them to have 3 lines to put their different names in on. It's a false economy to have 1 line in the survey for an assemblage of words. You'll find it hard to track that later. And the final one we wanted to look at was just one particular question, because there's a really good lesson here. This was a question about the pick-up and drop-off times for parents when the nursery reopened. Now, the thing that maybe occurs to the nursery is these are the times that work for us, and therefore we should give parents the choice, and that feels like a positive thing to do. But from a parent's perspective, they might look at that and just think, well, I don't understand for a start the difference between A and B. I mean, what difference does 8:30 to 3:30 or 9 to 3 make to me? I'm having to work from home. My job's gone all over the place. It's a really strange choice, that one. And I think without any further explanation there, this might lead to, again, it's another moment parents might start thinking what lies behind it. And I can tell the nursery as a parent what most parents are going to do looking at these three options. They'll just go for option C because they'll think, well, I'll go for C because it gives me the most time, and then I'll work back from that. I'll then tell them, well, I'll just come pick my kids up at 4 because that's what suits me. Whereas you might have the impression that if you go for A, you don't have that choice, but if you go for C, you do have that choice. So actually, most parents will probably go for the same answer here, just because of the way they're set up. So it's an obvious example of an institution thinking purely from its own perspective and not really understanding what it looks like from the parent's perspective. In this instance, we'd probably suggest that they just don't bother asking this question of parents. They just actually allocate times to parents and then deal with the consequences of that afterwards, because we doubt that this question would have given them any useful information to use after that. So just summarising all of that. So we think the survey sets up an excessively narrow scope and then asks some broader questions, and that jeopardizes its success. The purpose is unclear. It's very unclear whether this is a consultation about we want to gauge opinion. It does look like that in places, and then questions like this suddenly make you realize, oh no, this is if I answer C here, does that mean I can't get A later? It's not, you're not sure whether it's a decision-making tool. And that point about consequences, if that purpose isn't clear, it suddenly makes you ask yourself all sorts of questions about consequences, and it makes you nervous about answering, which might jeopardize completion rates.
Okay, so that's a sort of brief insight into listening. So the next part would have been about telling, but we're now at an hour, so we're not going to. I'm going to
as predicted. We didn't have time for that next section.
Very good, Pete. I'm just going to quickly run through what the outbound or telling stuff would look like. So the first thing is segmentation, and we sort of touched on this in the last workshop. That's about internally stratifying your communication to parents by importance and segmenting your parents to increase the likelihood of them acting on a communication. The second one's design. And, we've had a look at that today in a way with the survey, the importance of design. We had a look at that last time about emails and newsletters and why design is so important. And then the last one is technology. And just as a sort of, I put on the chat, the blog post that we did about it, but really there are free tools and software that schools can use that make both the design and the segmentation much easier. And so it doesn't take up any time or resource or whatever. But anyway, that's it. We hope you really enjoyed today, and I hope we hope you learned something and maybe have gained some insight into the ways that schools can listen. Unfortunately, we only have one time to look at one method, but we think it's probably the one that you can act on as a result of a workshop, an online workshop, most easily. And it's time for any questions.